I guess we can get started. Good evening, everyone. This is December 1st, 2022, and I welcome you to the Philadelphia chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians talk. I am David Briner, past president and current treasurer of the Philadelphia chapter, and I invite anyone who is not a member of our chapter to consider joining if you're interested in this and similar topics. You can find our website at philachaptersah.org, philachaptersah.org, and you can see our other programs on the site and find out about our officers, and you can join as well. I also would like to invite our members to our next event, which is our annual Pizza and Pictures event. Pizza and Pictures event at the Athenaeum, which has reopened, and this is exciting because it's been several years since we've been able to have pizza and pictures in person. But we'll be doing that on the night of Monday, January 23rd, 2023, starting at 6 p.m. So for those of you who are members of our local chapter, hope to see you there. Tonight's talk, like most of our talks, will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel for viewing later. So I invite you to revisit it if you are interested in that. And and so I'm just notifying everyone that we are recording this, and just so you'll know. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Al Willis, PhD, an independent architectural historian who was educated at the University of Chicago, Clemson University, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, with a PhD from Columbia University. Dr. Willis has published many articles on 20th century architecture in the US and abroad, and has given many talks on that and similar subjects. Having retired from Hampton University in 2013, he has since completed a series of consulting projects, and I'm glad to announce that his talk that he gave for our chapter in March of 2021 on Alfred Panepinto was so well received that we are very happy to have him back again to give a talk, this time entitled "A Big Fish in a Small Pond, Joe Bright, From Penn to Pioneering Modernism in Southern Georgia." And I will, rather than steal your thunder, Al, I will, instead of giving an introduction to your talk, I'll let you say whatever it is that you would like to while I recede into the background and admit any latecomers into our meeting. So if you would want to share your screen at this point, we welcome you and are happy to hear what you have to say.
And there we go. Thank you, David. And I am not Renata Milner, but I appreciate Renata letting me use her computer here at the Valdosta Lowndes County Historical Society, where they have a much more reliable internet connection than I'm used to. Let's see if we can make this work. Thank you. So, born into a family of prominent tobacco farmers in Kentucky, Joe Bright belonged to the generation of American architects who was not trained in modernist design, yet who came over the course of his career to practice as a modernist. Bright's education was prolonged by his enrolling in Centennial College and then transferring to the University of Louisville as a freshman engineering student in 1925. In 1926, he entered a third-degree program, that time in architecture and at Penn. Over the summer following his fourth year there, Bright had a remarkable opportunity to design a real project, the forestry building on the Kentucky State Fairgrounds. Like one of his Penn student projects that his family has preserved, it was in colonial revival style. Bright received his B.Arch from Penn in 1931. Employment was, of course, hard to come by in the twilight of the Hoover administration. Through 1933 and 1934, Bright did find work in the office of Curtis and Frankel, a respected firm in Lexington, Kentucky. Unfortunately, during that time, Curtis and Frankel were struggling to get work and appear to have landed only one sizable commission while Bright was in their employ, this school. From 1935 into 1937, presumably with a boost from his father's connections in Kentucky agriculture, Bright entered his 30s as an employee of American Tobacco Company. In that capacity, he traveled one summer to South Georgia, where in one of the larger markets of that region, the Lowndes County seat of Valdosta, he met his future bride. Marion Converse was a Valdosta girl from one of the town's oldest and notable families, educated at Shorter College and with a flair for the arts of drama and design. The two married in 1936 in the sanctuary of Marion's home church, the First Baptist, which is the outstanding architectural space of Georgia's southern tier. The wedding decorations included a string of electric lights that outlined the arch behind the choir loft, a modernistic effect that must have been startling to a town that would not see its next example of electrographic architecture until 1948. Under circumstances that are unclear, back in LaGrange, Kentucky, in 1936, Bright designed an immense yet relatively austere structure that appears to have been a residence, but that the National Register identifies only as a funeral home. Its styling evinces the young architect's persistent allegiance to the colonial revival. The fact that its symmetries are only approximate foretells a key feature of Bright's later works in modernism. Probably by the end of 1937, Bright had landed an enviable position as assistant to the curator of the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, James Cogar. Cogar's office, which Bright entered in 1938, assured the interface between the Rockefeller interests and their architects, Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn. It was also responsible for acquiring and placing furniture and other objects within all of the restored interiors. Between 1938 and 42, the dates of Bright's tenure, Williamsburg not only came into its own as a major tourist destination, but rose to further prominence in the architecture world with the execution of a second major phase of research and restoration. This phase included work on two of Williamsburg's best-known structures, the Peyton Randolph House and Chowning's Tavern. These are actually on that side at the far right, both of which exhibited growth by accretion in a manner from which Bright certainly drew important lessons. As Cogar's protege, a lifelong relationship as it turned out, Bright and Williamsburg helped to supervise that work. In doing so, he would have met not only the architects on site, but also members of the board of advisory architects, including presumably Lawrence Coker, and leading figures in interior decorating and the antiques trade. As a former student of engineering, the stripping in 1940 of the Ewing House to its frame may have interested Bright especially, as his use of the gambrel roof structure would suggest repeatedly thereafter. During World War II, at Morganfield, Kentucky, Bright served in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. There, he would have participated in the rapid expansion of nearby Camp Breckinridge. The massing of the Officers Club there, which must count as a late manifestation of the Prairie School, would have shown Bright some of the more promising possibilities for post-war American architecture, namely the achievement of balance without symmetry and the emphasis on horizontality. I conjecture that by the end of hostilities, Bright was already entertaining the possibility of opening his own office. His wife's hometown, where she still had many friends and relatives, around whom a clientele could coalesce, would have been a logical place to do it. He is known to have spoken with the longest established architect there, Lloyd Greer, about the possibilities of practicing in Valdosta, but at what point between 1945 and 1949 that consultation took place remains uncertain. In any event, he found post-war work as an architect in Macon, Georgia, with Dennis and Dennis. On the evidence of a clipping that Bright kept for the rest of his life, the works of that old and prestigious Georgia firm included a grand new suburban residence, making use of salvaged bricks and colonial revival styling. On such a project, Bright's experience from Williamsburg would have been of very high value. It was in 1949 that Bright finally established his own practice. Just how small its location, Valdosta, was at the time, with a population of about 20,000, is a question of relativity. But the absolute smallness of its pond of architects, into which Bright splashed down, is beyond dispute. His presence brought the number of local firms up from 2 to 3. Although both of the pre-existing firms had begun to offer modern solutions to their clients, the number of modern buildings standing in Valdosta or anywhere within an hour's drive in any direction could have been counted on one hand. The commission that jump-started Bright's Valdosta-based practice actually came in 1949 from outside the town. It was a resort at Radium Springs, located some distance northwest of Valdosta, for the noted hotelier Horace Caldwell. A symmetrical arrangement on a V-shaped plan, the inn develops a strongly horizontal composition. On the wings, large picture windows strike a modernistic note, even as they recall a window type Bright would have seen in Williamsburg. The quasi-modernism of the Radium Springs Inn reappeared in the first large residential commission he received in Valdosta, the Neal residence of 1950 in nearby Thomasville, which you have on the left. Set on a wide lot, it develops asymmetrically and horizontally behind a screen of widely spaced columns. It features a massive chimney rising from a hipped roof and functionalist placement of its window openings, several of which are oversized. In a modest duplex in Valdosta, one of Bright's first buildings there, the architect deployed similar mannerisms. From early 1951 dates Bright's design for the Dickey residence, another elongated composition with a gabled roof. It was Valdosta's first fully fledged post-war ranch house, as California architects, including William Worcester and Cliff May, had defined it. To enhance the Californian effect, Bright sided the house with board and batten, a street-side wooden fence, and a narrow porch completed the rather scenographic effect of its exterior and setting. The rustic feeling was carried through into the interior, whose plan arranges rooms in zones set to either side of a central entry hall. 3 of the rooms have fireplaces, and almost all of them were paneled floor to ceiling with pine. For George Turner, also in 1951, Bright designed what functioned almost in reality as a ranch house, since it stood next to the site of the client's livestock sales facility. Meanwhile, for clients whose tastes trended in a more traditional direction, Bright in the early 50s would produce houses frankly inspired by precedents in Williamsburg. The Tillman residence on the right here, with its enormous colonial style brick chimney, represented a kind of cross between the cottage and the ranch house types of its time. Reminders of Williamsburg continued to characterize Bright's residential work. The Davidson store's projecting picture window, which I've placed right here in the middle, divided into generous panes, and a prominently placed chimney were the most frequent ones. But there was also the lean-to, which Bright deployed with great boldness in the Smith residence of 1952. This house announced Bright's firm as Valdos's chief exponent of ultramodern architecture, thus setting a standard against which his fellow professionals on the local scene would have to compete. For many of his houses, Bright specified salvaged brick, or so-called old brick, as in the Perry residence, which exhibited most of what by 1952 had become the architect's characteristic features: horizontal lines, a big chimney, a recessed entrance, and functionally placed window openings flanked by blinds that in this case were not themselves so much functional as they were decorative. Bright's subsequent modern houses would seldom approach the outlandishness of the Smith residence, but instead would emphasize the low-key horizontality of the Perry residence, while eschewing its use of ornamentation. The best of them, both from 1953, appear to have been designed chiefly by Bill Tapp, a young architect whom Bright employed from 1950 to 1954. According to another of Bright's early draftsmen and apprentice architects, Blake Ellis, among Bright's salient advantages as a professional was his eye for up-and-coming talent, together with a willingness to allow his employees to work without undue criticism. The lean simplicity of the low-slung Tillman residence that Tapp produced under Bright's supervision featured a nearly all-glass south-facing front, which may indicate that it was intended to be a solar house. The likewise stark and low-slung Carroll residence appears possibly to have resulted more likely from a collaboration between Tapp and Bright himself. In the mid-1950s, Bright's residential commissions were concentrated in the newly platted subdivisions at the extreme northwestern outskirts of Valdosta, several of which were especially attractive to successful young professionals and entrepreneurs. Among the most prestigious of the new streets in the area was Terrace Boulevard, where Joe and Marion Bright acquired a lot and completed a house for themselves in about 1956. Nearby were to come a number of other houses varying in modesty and grandeur, as well as in stylistic expression, designed in Bright's office. Chief among them was the Weiner residence, completed in 1958 for clients who had decided not to execute a design made for them by Frank Lloyd Wright. According to Ellis, Bright assigned the project to him. A requirement was that the house utilize the structural and ornamental concrete blocks that Weiner's business had recently begun producing. The Weiners also desired a somewhat open plan and a placement on their capacious sloping lot that would be congenial to landscape gardening. The result was one of South Georgia's best modern houses, one that developed on a Y-shaped plan and on 3 levels. Relatively closed on the front, it opens on the back through glazed walls onto a screened porch and vast patio overlooking what would become one of South Georgia's most remarkable gardens. The house centers spatially on a massive chimney whose presence and scale mark the house indelibly as a Bright product, as if by signature. If Bright typically placed his chimneys against an exterior wall, usually the front wall, where such a placement would have been least expected, he had produced at least one earlier design in which a central chimney served as the chief feature and spatially organizing element of the interior. Just as exterior chimney placement signifies an 18th century Virginia tradition in colonial house design, a massive central one recalls an earlier tradition in New England building. In the Wright residence, designed for the family of an African-American bricklayer whom Wright knew in Valdosta's building world, a Roman brick chimney holding 3 fireplaces stands in the middle of an open-planned living area so as to divide it into reception, dining, recreation, and circulation zones. The cruciform shape of the open area recapitulates the cruciform shape of the entire house, which places the bedrooms and kitchen in the long arm, with its partie clearly foreshadowing that of the Wayner residence. The Wright residence remains the most notable of the modern houses in the predominantly Black southwestern section of Valdosta. It is by no means, however, the only work by Joe Bright in that section. During the 1950s, Bright entered into a relationship with the developers of the Glenlear Park subdivision in North Valdosta. Although the nature of that relationship is unknown, stylistic and circumstantial evidence points to the designs of nearly all the houses in Glenlear Park having been produced in his office. Most were built on spec, but a few appear to have been custom designs, like in the lower right as an example, for purchasers of lots. A curious fact about them is that no two are exactly alike. The presence of many houses of a modesty similar to that of the Glenlear Park spec houses went up in various Valdosta subdivisions in the 1950s and 60s, suggesting that Bright was a local supplier of stock plans to several different developers. In late 1956, perhaps to commemorate their move to Terrace Boulevard, perhaps as a 20th anniversary present, or perhaps as a Christmas gift, her husband, Marion Bright, assembled an album documenting the progress of his career since their years in Williamsburg. In this album, which I think is the single most valuable document relating to mid-20th century architecture in Valdosta, Marion Bright showcased her husband's residential work, but also took pains to demonstrate his firm's involvement in designing across a wide range of building types: recreational, commercial, civic, religious, and here, hospitality. Between the late 50s and Bright's death in 1976, non-residential work would comprise an increasingly large percentage of his output, even as most of his finest achievements would continue to be in the category of private houses. In 1960, about 5 years after moving into his Tapp-designed but Bright-approved residence, Raymond Tillman commissioned from Bright a small commercial building with a big sign. Its situation on what was developing in the 1950s as Valdosta's chief commercial strip demanded special treatment. Bright thus adopted the solution of detaching the sign from the building in precisely the manner that certain Philadelphians would soon learn from Las Vegas had become the typical approach to designing strip architecture everywhere. Curiously, The sign is now detached not only from its corresponding building, but also from that still extant building site. Bright appears to have designed similar signs, sometimes attached, sometimes detached, in one case semi-detached, for each of the several motels he designed along the Ashley Street strip. As is now well understood, thanks to those same Philadelphians, such signs serve as signifiers of the functions of the sheds they decorate. One motel among them, the Del Mar, stands out as both possessing one literal sign and constituting, in duck-like fashion, a second sign. Of the four pictured here, that's the one in the lower right, of course. Of the four pictured here, only the El Carlo is assigned by me to Bright on the basis of circumstantial rather than documentary evidence. The circumstance is that its owner, entrepreneur and developer David Shapiro, went on to become one of Bright's most faithful repeat clients. For Shapiro and his family, Bright designed two houses, the first of which was ultra-modern, intended to accommodate an indoor-outdoor lifestyle that Mrs. Shapiro had come to favor while visiting her in-laws in California. Its plan was adapted by Bright from one she had discovered in a lifestyle magazine. The design grouped all the rooms around what amounted to an outdoor living space. The exterior was veneered with Roman brick, a favorite material of Mr. Shapiro that had become, in turn, also a favorite of Bright, who specified it in both his Wright residence and the Del Mar Motel. The massing of the house reversed the sort of lean-to structure, now with only the faintest hints of its Williamsburg source, that Bright had earlier used to startling effect in the Smith residence. The second Shapiro residence on the top is more conventionally modern. Its plan adopts the V-shaped organization of the Radium Springs Inn. Its exterior is also faced with Roman brick, and each of its multiple facades plays a different game of asymmetrical and symmetrical balance. Also designed for Shapiro was the suburban shopping center on the, suburban plaza shopping center on the extreme northern edge of Valdosta, which was built in phases to eventually embrace a set of shops between two recreational anchors, a cinema and a bowling alley. Just to the south of Suburban Plaza lay a larger shopping center designed by Bright for another developer, Marshall Castleberry. Dubbed Castle Park, it was built in three phases. Like the Del Mar Motel's layout, that of both Suburban Plaza and Castle Park used strong diagonals to attract attention by inflecting toward oncoming traffic and to control the interface between a car-dominated outside and a human-scaled inside. An orthodontist's office in North Valdosta and Vincent's drugstore on Ashley Street, much closer to downtown, near the point where it was starting in the 1950s to become a strip, both employ diagonal walls to signal points of entry. Bright's experiments in diagonality culminated in his creation of a flower shop he designed in the mid-50s for the Zant interests on a site not far from the Suburban Plaza and Castle Park, thus convenient to Valdosta's burgeoning and largely well-to-do residential areas. Situated on a trapezoidal site facing a side street, the shop has one wall inflected toward the tail end of the Ashley Street strip and carried well above the roof line to form a kind of false front for signage. The steps of the entryway echo the diagonal of the signage wall. At the rear, which faces only an alley, a detail at ground level demonstrates Bright's meticulousness in extending the diagonal idea to even the least visible part of his design on the lower right. Clearly, Bright well understood the value of diagonality to signage design as well as to site and building planning. But where the tight rectangular site of the 1954 Veitch Baby Pharmacy precluded the exploitation of a trapezoidal or V-shaped plan, Bright nevertheless made strong diagonal statement in the building's sign. Incidentally, this building in 1960 became the only Bright design to receive national publicity, though the article in Drug Topics did not mention his name. The Veitch Pharmacy had already attracted local attention, however, to the extent that Paul Shepard had commissioned a similar building to house his accounting firm by 1957. It's in the upper right. In that same year, Shepard also commissioned a Monterey-style residence by Bright, one of Bright's first in a romantic stream of modernism that would dominate in the final phase of his career. In 1957, also, Bright designed the most substantial commercial building of his career, an office building for the Valdosta Times newspaper. It implements the same design principles he had brought to bear in the Shepard building, but on a much larger scale. In the mid-50s, Bright substantially remodeled a downtown building for use by the local Chamber of Commerce. Although resolutely modern, this work appears to have roots in the Williamsburg Restoration, in which Bright had participated in the 1930s. When Charles Sheeler had been invited to photograph Williamsburg in 1935-36, he used the opportunity to disclose the project's essence as a modern, or indeed modernist, phenomenon. Such of his pictures as Stairwell show that modernism existed within the Williamsburg project, not alongside it. Bright, having in his Chamber of Commerce job placed the new inside the old through remodeling, his wife, with her amateur camera, subsequently produced uncannily suggestive evidence that she understood not only the cultural significance of what he had done there, but also what Sheeler had understood colonial Williamsburg to have done. This is on the far right, Marion Bright's picture. Her snapshot shows, in fact, an instance of modernism not so much supplanting tradition as creating it. Some years later, in 1969, seemingly by way of acknowledging Mrs. Bright's insight, Bright designed a shop front that, without any ado, sentimentality, or compromise, but with much romanticism, inserted a Williamsburg shop front, modernized by folding it on a diagonal into a bay of his own modern design of Castle Park Shopping Center. Thus did Bright effect simultaneously a wedding of old and new and a marriage of art and commerce. In the realm of civic architecture, Bright produced an annex to the early 20th century Lowndes County Courthouse, a plain modernist box that contrasted sharply as possible with the neo-Baroque building. Thus, he followed the policy prevailing into the 1960s at Colonial Williamsburg of making any structure neighboring historical contexts self-evidently modern to avoid confusion. In the same civic realm, Bright was active as a designer of public housing for Valdosta and some other localities nearby. First, he was so as a member of an architects consortium. Later, for the Valdosta Housing Authority, he designed scattered site duplexes as an individual practitioner, lower right. Bright also designed a number of public schools for several South Georgia systems. In the late 50s and early 60s, these buildings were so-called equalization schools intended by southern states to bring the physical plants frequented by white and non-white cohorts into a condition of equilibrium. But whether for colored or for white, as the terminology of the time went, the architecture was indeed identically modern. The parties derived from the same California models, and the buildings themselves of the same mix of brick, glass, and steel. For congregations in the Valdosta Baptist Association, Bright did quite a bit of church work in the 50s. This work seems to have begun with his design in 1952 for a Baptist pastorium. The subsequent work included adapting the same stock plan from the Baptist Sunday School Board in Nashville to produce new Sunday school buildings for First Baptist of Valdosta and First Baptist of nearby Quitman. In connection with the building at Valdosta, Bright remodeled, and Bright's building you see on the lower left, okay? He, connection with the building, with that building at Valdosta, Bright remodeled the older Sunday school building, a work of Lloyd Greer in the center bottom, and to install a chapel in the lower right on its ground level. The new entrance to the chapel was colonial revival, even though the interior was modernistic. Thoroughly modern had been Bright's 1952 designs for a Baptist mission church, Valdosta's Northside Baptist Church, to be built in phases. A similar design, which may have been by Bright, was used in the construction of the Morning Star Baptist Church, upper right, for an African-American congregation. That design for Northside, Bright also adapted to his project for the Pyle Baptist Church. These are the two images on in the middle right and the lower right. The last, however, was carried out in concrete block to a much simpler, less obviously modern design by Bright. Bright designed modern buildings not only for Baptists, but also for Methodist and Jewish congregations. In 1960, he added a colonial revival portico to the existing Westminster Presbyterian Church in Valdosta, while at the same time designing a Sunday school annex at the rear in what might be described as a vernacular modern style, similar to that he had used for Pyle Baptist Church. The reversion at Westminster Presbyterian and in the First Baptist Chapel porch to a self-consciously imitative colonial revival manner was paralleled in Bright's 1961 design for a new dining hall at Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College at Tifton, Georgia. There, the construction remained without ornament and hence arguably modern, but the partie Bright obviously derived from Southern Greek revival precedents. In all of those buildings, as well as in Bright's Monterey design for the Shepherd residence, Bright was slipping away from hegemonic modernism into an alternative romantic modernism that in the early 60s, its most expert proponents were calling atmospheric. The difference is seen clearly in the last two of the three residential projects Raymond Tillman commissioned from Bright's office. The Tillman Weekend House at Twin Lakes near Valdosta on the left evinced an unmistakable modernism, albeit one that had fully assimilated recollections of Williamsburg so much as to make them almost undetectable. The Tillmans' later house on the north side of Valdosta, by contrast, is a freely romantic composition based on Monterey, but also New Orleans imagery. Its modernism remains to be seen in the asymmetry of its several facades, but it is no longer a thoroughgoing expression. In 1964, thus slightly ahead of the last Tillman residence, Bright reached in the Story residence the pinnacle of his achievement in residential design. On the exterior, a variety of textures, together with the recession and advance of masses, creates a scenographic effect, while styling touches give the house a traditional look and feel without evoking any specific period. This sprawling house on a very large lot contains 5 bedrooms. Here, I'll leave it there. It contains 5 bedrooms on 2 floors, as well as extensive living and service space on the ground floor. Patios at the back invite indoor-outdoor living. The house is modern by virtue of its functional plan, which allows each of the rooms to be optimally sized and positioned to best advantage. On the ground floor, they are disposed in linear fashion along a single loaded hallway that culminates in a galley kitchen. Functionalism prevails in the kitchen as well as in the bathrooms, while in the family room, a corner window, this is on the right, a corner window playfully quotes a cliche of modern design. The decor of the other main rooms is either of neutral or traditional character. Everywhere, the dialectics Bright set up between the decorated and the plain, the larger and the smaller, the formal and the casual, betray the architect's highly sophisticated sense of what design could achieve in the modern era. The second owners of the Story residence became, in the course of their occupancy, great admirers of Bright and eventually commissioned what became his final achievement in his architectural career. This took the form of a surgeon's office for Dr. Jerry Purvis in Valdosta. At first glance, the building appears to be a straightforward reproduction of some Williamsburg original. Such, however, is certainly not the case. Although its footprint does all but copy that of the governor's palace of colonial Virginia, the interior organization had necessarily to meet the late 20th century requirements of an up-to-date medical facility. Evidencing externally the functionalism within, in accordance with the most fundamental tenet of modern architectural doctrine, the building presents 4 different facades, of which all but the street facade are asymmetrical. From the east front projects a quotation of the Davidson store's great window in Williamsburg, but in doing so, throws into sharp focus the fact that here is no pastiche, but rather a complete assimilation of lessons learned long ago by an aging and, in point of fact, dying architect. The quotation also brings into focus the status of the building as a demonstration of modernism's complicated relationship between itself and what had gone before, between how the modern project could create new things out of obsolete ones by making them new or indeed modern once again. Joe Bright, over fewer than 30 years of practice in an out-of-the-way place considered beneath the notice of his contemporaries operating in or out of America's cultural centers, or even Atlanta, explored in his work a set of issues that overlapped considerably with those whose exploration gave rise to the Philadelphia School. Here you see some of them listed and illustrated. He belonged to the generation of that school, graduating from Penn only 7 years after Louis Kahn, yet in no sense was Bright a part of it. Beyond the simple fact of having left Philadelphia in 1931, he seems to have practiced without theorizing what he did, a habit that was evidently required for membership in the famous avant-garde of the city of brotherly love. Nevertheless, an examination of his output suggests that all of his work reposed upon a strong theoretical foundation. A question arises: what was being done in the studios of the 1920s at Penn that prepared a cadre of architects not only to embrace a modernism that had not been explicitly taught to them, to excel at it, and even to push its limits beyond the breaking point? I thank you for listening.
Thank you for a very inspiring talk, and thank you to all the people who contributed to your work on this. Thank you for giving them credit. I am glad to open the floor up to questions or comments. You're invited to put your questions in the chat box or turn on your mic and speak up. Let's absorb Al's email address there, and then maybe after a few seconds you can unshare, Al, so that we can see people's faces. Terrific. So I invite anyone to get the conversation going. Well, I have a question, and I'm sure Dan will have some as well. Al, my question has to do with what kind of acknowledgement does Valdosta and South Georgia have of his legacy? When you were doing your research, were people somewhat familiar with his career? Was it a big surprise to them? Have many of his buildings been demolished? What's the context for this?
Well, first of all, I'd say that growing up here in the 60s, I became aware that his name was a kind of household name. He was, I think probably a very gregarious and social person. He seemed to have been well known to everyone. And when you mentioned an architect, his name often came up. There are the fate of his works is very mixed. There are many of his, more important buildings that have been either remodeled beyond recognition, or somewhat remodeled, or I guess, worst of all, torn down. On the other hand, there are many people who very much appreciate the buildings that he, left as a legacy here to Valdosta, and they are, much prized by the people who live in them or who discover them on the market and quickly snap them up. So it's a bit mixed, I would say. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to, get his work recognized by more people in Valdosta and even beyond.
Thank you.
I would like to add that he must have made quite an impression, because my dad hired him, and correct me if I'm wrong, Al, to build his first house on William Street, and then the house that his parents lived in, the one that you had the photo, and then my dad's actual house that was built in I think 60 or 61. But my dad was completely committed and hired him and his office to do all three of his homes that he wanted to have built.
Right.
So
and possibly also his veterinarian office, possibly.
I think so. Yeah. My
Right.
dad was sold on him, and my dad was one of those. I mean, he was old school South Georgia, country, rural, and this guy was from the big city, you know, further up north. And my dad embraced him, obviously.
Or so he thought. He was actually from Eminence, Kentucky, which is way smaller than Valdosta.
It's
But-
still north.
But the person who's been speaking is Sally Quirin, and her father was Lois Turner, and her grandfather was George Turner. So she has generations of experience with Joe Bright's architecture to share with us, I guess. I believe that the second house you mentioned, the first house that Lois Turner lived in Valdosta, I believe that he was actually the second occupant of that house upon researching it further.
Okay.
And so he's part of an interesting group of people, and it's a fairly large group of people who seem to have been second owners of Joe Bright houses, who evidently discovered who had designed the houses they were living in, and then went on to hire him to design a custom house for their occupancy. So Lois Turner, I believe, was in that quite interesting group.
Well, I must say the Tidewaters, I think it's called Tidewater Cypress paneling that he put in the den of the home that I grew up in is absolutely gorgeous, and it's still gorgeous today.
Yes.
He was a perfectionist.
That
for
is
sure.
that is true. And the one slide I showed of the Zantz flower shop, of the little detail only visible in the alleyway, I don't know how better you could prove that what a perfectionist he was. But all of his buildings that I've been privileged to see are distinguished by, you know, incredibly fine materials that were carefully selected and excellent detailing. They are built to the highest standards. And, you know, unless somebody brings a bulldozer to push them down, I don't think they're going anywhere.
Dan, you are muted. We can't hear you.
Surely he wants to speak about those certain Philadelphians.
No. I don't know who you were talking about. No. I'm curious about your view of Joe Bright as a mentor, because the evolution of his work and the integration of and evolution of modernism in his work seems to have, I'm wondering if it has any relationship to the freedom he allowed the people who worked in his office. I mean, he seems to have allowed an autonomy, but yet they were distinctly his works nonetheless.
I'm glad you asked that. I think there is definitely a relationship. I believe when he was at Williamsburg working in the office of James Kogar, who was somebody I'd like to know more about, but from what little I've discovered about him so far, is that one didn't so much as work for James Kogar as work with James Kogar.
Okay.
And I think that is an important distinction, and that's basically a mentoring relationship, or the definition of one. And I believe that among the things he learned at Williamsburg from the experience in Kogar's office was how to become involved in a mentoring relationship. And my information about how he interacted with his employees, and it is unquestionable that he was employing in Valdosta really top of the line talent, people who would leave his office to go to distinguished, very successful careers elsewhere. And I think he had learned in Williamsburg that the way to get the best from these people was essentially to leave them alone, let them push themselves as far as they possibly could, and only when necessary, rein them in. And that way of organizing an office or running an architectural office, I think, is what accounts for the fact that it's a little bit difficult to pick out Joe Brights when you drive down the street that you are pretty sure is full of them, because there's a great variety. And I think of stylistic expression. And I think some of this is due to the varying inputs from the various assistants. And in part, it's also due to his own versatility, because he was, as you could see, very adept in doing sort of convincing versions of Williamsburg designs and convincing works of modernism, and everything in between.
Yeah. Yes, that's my question. Yeah. Okay. Am I mute? Oh, am I muted again?
And I
No,
would like to,
Okay.
I would like to add that he was almost like a salmon swimming upstream in South Georgia. I mean, he came here obviously because he fell in love with someone from this area and saw the opportunity, but he was really, modernism was not really going very far down here. And I know that I have I have the set of the plans that he built for my dad's house, and it's a very typical ranch house. But I also have the first set of plans, which was a brilliant, modern, just thinking out of the box, home. And my dad probably said, no, I don't want that. I want what everybody else is doing down here. So it's unfortunate, kind of in a way, that he probably was not given as many opportunities as he, could have to really bloom in that field, because he was having to work with people that wanted the traditional, wanted what everybody else was doing.
Well, my response to that, Sally, and all your points are very well taken. My response to that is that in working with these clients that you thought might not have been very congenial in certain respects to the kind of architecture that he wanted to make or could make, I think is that these experiences were what caused him to invent this kind of in-between modernism, where the modern he could do something that was very modern in terms of massing and plan layout, and even to a certain extent detailing and the choice of materials. But at the same time, it could satisfy a certain desire for traditional lifestyles or traditional appearance. And that accounts for why so few of his buildings, you think, well, they're sort of essays in period design, and yet they don't correspond to any particular period, which of course was the obsession in Williamsburg and the obsession of colonial Williamsburg. And it's something that he left behind.
I think one of the things that shines through in your presentation is that he made a virtue of the necessity to keep his houses perhaps more conservative and less stridently modernist than he otherwise might have had them be. So I think I think he made a real virtue of that constraint, in a way, if it was a constraint.
Well, I think it probably was a constraint, but on the other hand, from a marketing point of view, I mean, he was out there, and if you were one of these few Valdostans who wanted like the Shapiros, who wanted something really very unusual, he was your go-to guy.
Yeah. Really interesting.
He listened to his client. I mean, he listened to what they wanted, and I think he delivered to everybody. That's why everybody was so happy with what they got from him. And it was all quality, just perfection, no matter what it was.
Yes.
Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Sally.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Al, I found this and your other presentations to be very inspiring. You are
Well, thank
hunting
you.
down a part of American history that is being ignored by others. And this is what it takes, going through and looking at all the material that is available that no one else is looking at. I'm also glad to see that some of our participants are putting comments in the chat box about their appreciation, about some additional information they have about these buildings. And it is good to know that the community does have members who are aware and are interested in this legacy. So
Well, thank you for saying that.
well, it's true.
Well, I mean, I enjoy doing it. I guess kind of my mission is to like go out and discover some of these people who, for whatever reason, never made it into the history books, but probably who do deserve a place there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd like to thank everyone who's participated. A lot of new names, and I know some of you are relatives of Joe Bright or possibly of former clients of his or otherwise interested in South Georgia history. We're great to have shared this with you. I'm sorry that I was a little bit cautious about letting people in and knowing who people were. We have had problems in the past. I wanted to make sure that Al's presentation was not interrupted. Yes, I agree that Joe Bright would have been very proud of this research and this presentation. Joe, I hope that you continue to work on topics like this, and we'd love to have you back in another year or so and maybe learn about some other project you're working on. So thanks again.
Thank you.
From the chapter, and happy holidays to everybody, and good night.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. Thank you.